My name is Jonathan Lincoln. For those who don't know me, I'm director of the Center for Jewish Civilization here at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Very delighted today to welcome our guest, Josh Leifer. Josh, for those who don't know him or aren't following him, he's a journalist and historian. He is currently a columnist for Haaretz newspaper in Israel. His essays and reporting have also appeared in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, Guardian, and elsewhere. In full disclosure, I myself have used a number of his excellent articles to try and help explain Israeli history and politics in some of our courses here at the CJC. Also wanted to mention what we'll talk about it in a second, but his first book, Tablet Shatter, The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life in 2024, which won a National Jewish Book Award. And as I said, we'll talk about that in a second. He's currently a doctoral candidate in history at Yale University, where his research sits at the nexus of modern intellectual history, modern Jewish politics, U.S. foreign policy, and Holocaust memory. Sort of a perfect fit for the CJC. I think you've hit all of our pillars in some ways, but we appreciate you doing your studies at Yale University. And his project examines, his dissertation is examining the politics of anti-Semitism and the crisis of the liberal order. Also, Josh just recently became a father, so mazal tov to you and your family, and thanks for taking some time away from them. We really appreciate it to help enlighten us on, I think, an important topic, but still, we do appreciate you taking the time. So just as a bit of housekeeping, Josh and I will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from our audience. And so, Josh, welcome. If it's okay, I was hoping we could start with really the excellent book. I think we were talking a little bit outside, and we were talking about this sort of genre, and I took it upon myself to try and read your book alongside Noah Feldman's "To Be a Jew Today," both by Elliot Cosgrove, rabbi at the Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, and of course Peter Beinart's book on Jewish reactions to the war in Gaza. But yours predates October 7th, right? But it came out just after, right? Is that what? So obviously you wrote it before. And it's I don't even know if it's appropriate to lump all of these books together in some ways. But maybe you can try and help us understand a little bit about what was happening before and then sort of since October 7th in terms of these discussions at this sort of crossroads in some ways on particularly American Jewish life. But really, what led you to the topic? And how do you see that given events really, since October 7th in Israel, Gaza, as beyond? So we'll start there with that, it's the triple barras question, and then try and dig down a little deeper into the topic of the day. Yeah, reason.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here and to speak with all of you. It's a really good question. I hadn't thought, of course, I see on Amazon that people are buying old books together. And so I have a little bit of a sense of the kind of conversation that the algorithm, at least, has created. I mean, we all, I think everyone you name roughly knows each other in some sense because with the world of Jewish writing is small. I have, but when he mentioned something, I was like, the difference between some of those people and me is that those are all like the other guys are all Gen X guys, basically the same age, probably. I don't know, early 50s, I would say, from what I know. Maybe late 40s or at this for everyone. And I think that they were coming from the perspective of here was the Jewish world I knew, and it's that's no longer what the Jewish world is like. So what does that mean, and how do you grapple with it? And when I was writing the book, I was coming from a different place in the sense that I was, I guess, part of a cohort of young Jews who were trying to change the Jewish world, and in some ways creating the phenomenon to which some of those books ended up either being responses to, or in the case of my former colleague Peter, I think trying to direct into or corral into a new direction. Um, the funny thing about the book is that I didn't plan on writing it. Um, I was at the time I was working as an editor at Jewish Crime magazine, and like I'm very lucky in that an editor and an agent wanted to wanted to pitch a book upon the millennial disillusionment with Israel. This was in the fall uh, of 2020. That was when like first contact was made. So it was a very different time. And I sold the book proposal. Um, this is like the mercenary dark world of of commercial publishing. I sold the book proposal after the Israel-Gaza war in May 2021, which I think in retrospect is a very important turning point in the American public discourse on Israel-Palestine. That was really the first time that you could argue that Palestinians gained what I would say called the permission to narrate. For a very long time, the op-ed occasion in the New York Times had been dominated by people like essentially me, roughly like American Jewish Hebrew speaking people or roughly Israeli affiliated people who were able to somehow translate Israeli reality into the world of American journalism. But then I think largely and then for Sally, it's a salutary, generally salutary effect in the wake of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter moment, people being much more conscious about the people experiencing oppression, being the people authorized to speak about it. Editors, and I was one of them, began to seek out Palestinian writers to tell the story in ways they hadn't been doing before. And the effect in May 2021 was beginning and hadn't quite kind of reached the proportions that it has in the wake of the most recent war. My book, obviously, I'm not Palestinian, American Jew, but my book was kind of framed as a corollary to that phenomena, was going to explain to a progressive American audience, not specifically to a Jewish audience, what the millennial Jewish experience was and how the relationship to Israel has changed. Now, obviously, you read the book, you follow that's happened over the last couple of years. That actually isn't how the book ended up being received by the public, and we can get into that. But I guess I'll try to close this winding question by saying that what you said is absolutely true, and that the book was charting a phenomena that I understood to be long in process by the fall of 2020. I submitted the final manuscript about a week before October 7th. And then initially I thought, well, this was bad timing. I'm not going to change anything because I've already sunk into 110,000 words to this project. And I was lucky that I had editors who were looking after me and said, no, you have an obligation to update this. And so over the winter, I rewrote about 20,000 words of the book. Again, it was in media, like it was in the middle of events. I was just looking through the book again. I was like, oh. But I was trying to keep track of a moment. One of those, when you write a book, it's really agonizing to look back and read it because it's the only things you got wrong. But people often ask me, did October 7th change the way you understand American Judaism? I say no, actually. Like, that may sound crazy. I would argue that I don't even think October 7th changed the fundamental political dynamic as Israel-Palestine. You can also talk about there's a profound stuckness in like global politics generally, or certain parts of global politics. But everything that I think we've seen since October 7th, in the American Jewish world and the world of American politics, I think was fairly predictable, for me at least, looking at where the trend lines were going. Now, there are some elements that surprised me. Also, get into that, but more or less, I think like things ended up where I thought they were going to go.
Okay, so let's dig down. That's thank you for that. I think that's important for us to sort of understand that foundation in terms of your base, where you're coming to this topic from. So, I mean, to jump right into this idea of Israel-Diaspora relations, and really, I guess what we're talking about is Israel-U.S. Jews,
Yes.
Relations, and what are or at least the major fault lines between Israelis and American Jews that you see today?
Yeah. Um, there are a lot of them, and they get greater with each passing day. Um, I mean, the thing that struck me the most when I was writing the book was that for American Jews, what Israel is like is a question of existential importance to their identities. For Israeli Jews, what American Jewry is like is completely irrelevant to their daily lives. And that fundamental asymmetry shapes all of Israel, US diaspora, Jewish relations. I mean, when I was reporting on progressive politics, on progressive Jewish politics in the States, I was often struck, a minister of the Israeli government can say a ludicrous statement, and that statement could make or break a multiracial political coalition in an American city between Jewish organizers and their non-Jewish allies. Nothing any American Jewish figure or non-Jewish figure, for that matter, at that level will have any implications for Israeli politics, save for at the hottest geopolitical level, where what Donald Trump says he does really matters for what Israel as a state can do. And without getting into too much of the political theory of it, and there's the reason why. It's because for Israeli Jews, they have a sovereign state as the container of their identity, and American Jews don't. And I think the word sovereign there is actually really important. American Jews, by virtue of being the diaspora, and don't have the same kind of sovereignty over their ability to determine their fates. There might be good things about that, but there are also drawbacks to it in terms of deep buffeted by forces far beyond your control. I mean, there are lots of other differences, and probably the main other difference that I would highlight is the place of religious liberalism / the place of orthodoxy in Jewish life. So for most Israelis who are not what's in Israel, there are two forms of orthodoxy. There's ultra-orthodoxy, and there are people who are called religious, basically. Even combined, ultra-Orthodox and religious Israeli Jews don't make up the majority of Israeli Jewish population. But what it means is that Israel has something I would call Orthodox normativity. For secular Israeli Jews, the synagogue they don't go to is Orthodox. That's the expression. American Judaism is probably the greatest experiment in American Jewish religious liberalism, BDS. It often surprises people to learn that ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jews comprise maybe 10% of the American Jewish population, which means that there are really powerful, long running liberal streams of American Jewish life. And most American Jews think of their Judaism as in sync with their liberal values. Most Israeli Jews think of Judaism and liberalism in some ways as opposed, basically. But there is kind of give and take between these two things. It has to be very carefully negotiated. There's one way to think about it. Again, despite Israeli politics. One way to think about the Jew, accepting the current state of Israel for 1 second. American Jews hear Jewish and democratic and say, yeah, it goes together. Absolutely. Israelis hear Jewish and democratic and say, there are trade-offs. One comes at the cost of the other. The more democratic some of the state is, the less Jewish that might mean it is in some instances. So I would say that's kind of, broadly speaking, the big cleavages between the communities.
Sure. So sort of building on that, boom, we were talking about this. One of your colleagues wrote a long article in Haaretz recently on this conference in Boston on the Jewish left in America. And there are sort of two questions that I have from that. And in some ways, I mean, there was a big discussion there about this sort of cleavage towards Zionism and its unifying factors and its polarizing factors. And of course, that depends how you define Zionism, right? And terms like Zionism, like liberal Zionist, like anti-Zionist, non-Zionist, there is a So it's one way to put it, a rich or almost an angsty type of conversation that's happening. So I want to ask two questions about that. And one is about, the word itself, which may, I'd love to dig into, but also, just the fundamental question, building on your answer to the last question. Does this internal Jewish conversation, I think I know the answer, but that's a leading question in a way. Does this internal Jewish conversation in the United States translate in any way in Israel, even in a sort of post October 7th reality? So are Israeli Jews and American Jews talking about the same things?
I generally tend to think that they are talking about very different things. And I think that, like, I think the parameters of the American Jewish conversation are being roughly set by the way that Zionism has come to be understood in progressive Enlightenment spaces, which is basically at worst equivalent to Nazism, at best rationalization for apartheid. And that means that American Jews, broadly speaking, who want access to progressive political spaces, have to navigate a very complicated position vis-a-vis Zionism. I think that's an extremely limited and historically incorrect statement, and there have been lots of versions of Zionism that would have rejected the current form of the state of Israel without rejecting the principle of Jewish self-determination. There were many conversations 10 and 15 years ago, let's say, basically, let's put it that way, about whether the Jewish left should have try to argue that a different kind of Zionism was possible. So this is about getting into ancient history that even precedes my time. The organization that is now known as J Street had its roots in something that was called the Progressive Zionist Alliance, I think, or something like that. That there was an investment in the possibility that it's true that Israel has reached a point of a certain kind of moral objectionableness, and it doesn't mean that the principle of Jewish self-determination forming state is necessarily has to look this way. And at a certain point, whether out of just the way things went or also people's conscious decisions, that argument stopped being really made. And it was Zionism is what Zionism does, actually existing Zionism. So if Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International say Israel is an apartheid state, and I think that what's happening in Palestine is pretty accurately described as apartheid, people said, then Zionism is apartheid. I'll say, put this into brackets, like as someone who is also, as many young people are, like a former Marxist, I don't think that it's it would never struck me as a really compelling argument that I didn't think that Marxism was what Marxism did. Otherwise, I wouldn't have argued that a humane socialism was possible, considering that there's no real regime that's ever been a humane socialist state. But I held to the view that was possible. So I don't think it's a craven contradiction to say, on paper, I think that this should be possible. It's not, doesn't mean I'm not committed in some sense to the principles, but I can understand why people who don't want to happen to have that conversation and want to be part of a broader progressive world will say, look, for tactical reasons, you can take Zionism and we won't fight over it. Now in Israel, the word Zionism, like in Hebrew discourse, the word Zionism plays a very different role in that it's kind of how do I put it? It's like you only use it to accuse someone of not being one. In other words, when centrist parties are want to make lines for who they're willing to sit with or future coalition, they'll say, we're only willing to sit with Zionist parties. The implication is they're not going to sit with the Palestinian-led parties who doctrinally aren't Zionists for lots of historical reasons that are very understandable. It's in some ways that the use of anti-Zionist as a cudgel in Israel is really a way of kind of delegitimizing Palestinian political participation. I think in America the function is different. Is there an end to that question that I?
No. But I mean,
the conference. You want to get into the conference?
Well, not just the conference, but I mean, so why are we talking about Zionism without saying any of the works that the open-ended questions? But You know, why are we obsessed? Why are we obsessed with this? It is, in other words, is this the fault line or not? If it's not, um, why is that word come back? And suddenly,
I think I think the term has come back for like a set of reasons that are. I'm just thinking I'm out loud here, and I'm willing to be challenged and corrected. I think for like a combination of factors, processes that are coming actually from different places. Um, so one reason is that American Jews, and this is something that I write about in Tatler Chatter, American Judaism hollowed itself out over the course of the second half of the 20th century and made support for Israel basically the Align Alive ways, the end all be all of Jewish identity. But that meant that once Israel was not a place that American Jews could identify with proudly or felt ashamed about or were facing political challenges to, then what had been the center piece of one of the central pillars, there are two others that I read about in the book, Americanism and liberalism, what had been one of the central pillars of American Jewish identity suddenly entered into a kind of legitimacy crisis. One of, I would argue, the warping features of the debate in America and how it's projected onto Israel-Palestine is that people take the fact that Zionism is facing a legitimacy crisis in the discourse of the progressive world of American politics and say that means that Israel as a state is facing a terminal legitimacy crisis in the Middle East. Might be, but also it might, I actually think that that's really kind of not true. And in some ways, I think the other direction from which the new contestation of Zionism is coming is a almost utopian argument coming from, I would argue, let's say the radical left, that the current state of Israel can be removed. That the fight, this is not the Oslo Caravan for two states. It's not even necessarily the South Africa paradigm of nonviolent anti-apartheid struggle. The Hamas October 7th attacks brought back the Algeria paradigm. And so it's not the apartheid West Bank or Israel's unjust subjugation of Palestinians in part of historic Palestine. It's the whole thing itself, the project, the Zionist project. I think that the maximalism of that part of the radical left has far outstripped what's possible in reality. To put it bluntly, and actually, the Palestinian analyst and writer Yazid Saik has a really interesting post very recently about this very thing. So I'm not taking credit for this analysis, but in some ways, the worse things got. This is a problem that a lot of activist movements face. The worse things get, the more ambitious the demands get. And I think that that's something that's a process that's very hard to stop. It's also very damaging to political movements. Our compromise didn't work, so now we're going to double down and demand something more radical. So the fundamental power differentials on the ground haven't changed. Then it doesn't make the more radical thing more likely. Actually, makes it less likely. And so that's, I think, the other place from which the contestation of Zionism is coming as like a discursive force. Because if you were to look only geopolitically and not focus on the books that are, on display in your favorite indie bookstore or what you see on Twitter, you would see that all of the European Union backed Israel in its war against and Hamas, with the exception of very few symbolic military restrictions. Israel has faced basically no state consequences, with the exception of the ICC charges against Netanyahu and vouched for the war. If anything, the two-state paradigm has been reinvigorated by this Saudi French initiative with the UN and the Trump plans. And the fact that more countries are recognizing the state of Palestine isn't at the expense of Israel, but it actually is meant to bolster Israel's legitimacy and breathe new life and to say power. So if you only look at kind of geopolitics on that level, you don't see what you might see from a different precinct of, say, Brooklyn, for instance, where some of the more maximalist rhetoric has become like the norm.
Fascinating. It's a huge topic. I mean, it sort of raises even more questions, but I'll try with it when I prepared for this, and then open it up to the audience in a few minutes. But I want to then maybe go back, to this conference and a little bit to your book. I mean, and maybe look a little bit at the United States, in particular, the Jewish community in the United States. I mean, for what you see here with all of its diversity, and I think that there was an interesting line there, and maybe something you're well placed to talk about, that the Jewish left in the United States is becoming maybe more radical politically, but also less secular as well. And so they're seemingly contradictory movement. All of this adds up to the sort of fundamental question: are we moving? And I think that what your book is trying to ask, are we moving to a Jewish identity that is decoupled, that can be decoupled from Israel? Is that even possible? Is that what these movements are doing, or are they not really reaching that level?
In my experience as someone who passed through those movements, I always felt, this would be long before October 7th, but there was a tension between on the one hand, you have a movement that says, we're building a Jewish future beyond Zionism, beyond Israel. But then the lefty Jewish minion, or where those people pray, replaces the prayer for the state of Israel with a prayer or a kind of confession of Jewish culpability for the Nakba. That's fine. I actually think that that might be a good thing, but it's not decentering Israel from your Jewish identity. It's just flipping the bill. So instead of saying, okay, American Judaism had this kind of weird liberal in the lowercase L, liberal religious Zionism, where Israel was baked into the liberal Jewish practice of as a kind of miniature exemplar American Jewish liberal values in miniature. Now we flip it, so Israel is actually the great sin of the Jewish people, and we all are culpable, and we all have to repent for it, and it's become kind of a center of liturgy. That would be that is not moving beyond the centrality of Israel to Jewish identity. I think that the impulse towards religiosity does come from the sense that, okay, so if it's not going to be Israel, which is basically what our parents, roughly, those of us who grew up in the suburban mainline Jewish synagogue world, on Yom Kippur, there's Israel bond flyers on your chair. If that's not the religion anymore, then what's going to be? Have to come up with something else. But I think that opens up a whole other realm of, to me, very interesting, but theological questions, what is the status of Jewish of halachic observance to you? Is religiosity really kind of an aesthetic move? Okay, so we can't wave the Israeli flag, but maybe we can wave a different flag. This is where also you see the kind of neo-Bundist Yiddish revival that happened. Okay, so we're not going to be Zionist, but we'll be this other form of Jewish nationalism that doesn't exist in the real world anymore, but existed at one point, and then it can exist again, and we'll borrow some terms for them, like Doikite, which we really like. And there is a kind of Bund fetish that has happened, and I say this as someone whose grandmother was literally in the Bund. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's nice. I also the workman's circle. It's cool.
How much is that of that is a result of just the sheer fact that Israel exists, right? So, in other words, it's easy, and this is something you've said before. So I'm picking up your own words, and so but anti-Zionism before the state of Israel exists actually meant something. You could actually say there's an alternative. You say, no, we're not going to. We're not a people. We're not this. The reform movement of the United States.
It was the most radical.
But now, is there anything beyond that? So in other words, in some ways, the Zionist revolution has been complete in some ways in its the reformation of the Jewish identity.
Right. Well, so if you want to get really heady about it, I would say something like what we're really talking about is that the Jewish opponents of Zionism now have to come up with a coherent concept of Jewish collectivity that is different from the one that Zionists hold. And that's not so easy if you are also not Orthodox, basically. Because there is an older theological strand of anti-Zionism, which says that Jews are a people and all Jews are connected to one another. However, basically, Zionism is a secular heresy that's meant to hasten the end of days, and it's or if you know at both extreme, the Satmar Rebbe of the Satmar Hasidic side was exactly a satanic plot to delay the redemption by making people say, okay, so that's like hardcore ultra-Orthodox theological anti-Zionism, which in some ways parts of the new liberal anti-Zionism is pulling from. And interesting, it's not a coincidence that Shul Magid, who's a friend blurber of my book, is translating the collected writings of the Satmar Rebbe into English so that a new generation of Jewish anti-Zionists can learn from his wisdom. I will say, I have read the Satmar Rebbe's works, and his worldview is pretty far from the progressive one that most liberal anti-Zionists hold to. But that's interesting. These acts of historical reclamation at the intellectual level are interesting. What they mean politically, though, I'm very skeptical. I mean, one reason, though, why I think that this conference is important and does make a splash, and things like it make a splash, and why the Bundesrevivalism makes a splash, and why all of these sort of alternative attempts to find a new Jewishness make a splash, is that in the American context, Judaism is religious identity. Judaism is confessionalized over a historical process so that it is like Protestantism or Catholicism, much more than it is direct nationality. In fact, I love this anecdote because it's also ancient history at this point. Way back in 2016, there was a lot of pressure on the Trump administration from like right-wing pro-Israel groups to make anti-Zionism a form of discrimination that would be protected under was it Title VI? And there was when the New York Times sent out the push notification, there was a huge hubbub over, oh my God, Donald Trump is making Jews a race. He's re-racialized American Jews, just like the Soviet Union did, which when the Jews had Ivri written on their passports. Now we're Jews is our relation, but we're Americans. This is the liberal response to that. And so I think that given the working definition of Judaism as a religion, more or less for the bulk of American Jews, in America, you only have a religion if you do the religion. So Judaism will be defined by whoever is doing the Jewish things. It happens to be that very few American Jews do that many Jewish things. So on the battlefield of Jewish identity, whoever is doing stuff are the people who are contesting it. That means that the ultra-Orthodox, the Orthodox are contesting it. It also means that liberal anti-Zionists are contesting it because they're saying we're Jewish and we have a stake in the meaning of Judaism needs. Your average American Jew, like I don't need to talk ill of people I grew up with, who are not very interested in their Jewish, take it for granted, don't think much about it, do the has bar mitzvah, go to shul, whatever, like are not participating in the fight in the same way. And so, like, because you could argue that there's like to use political science, there's like mass abstentionism on the part of most American Jews in the argument about what the Jewish future is going to be. In some ways, it's determined by the people who are most engaged. This is also true of American politics. Why is American politics polarized? Because people who are involved in politics are also people who hold, generally speaking, the most extreme views. People who don't hold very extreme or like very passionate views don't participate in politics to the same degree.
but certainly resonates with where we are today in many ways. I'm about to open it up to the audience. There seems to be a few questions. I'll start by Jennifer.
Thank you so much for coming. I read your book. Fantastic. It raised a lot of questions for me personally. So many questions I could ask, but just ask one. Do you see room for a revival of Jewish Enlightenment values? And I ask this as someone who would call myself an observant Reform Jew. I go to synagogue every Saturday, I have Torah study, I do services, but just in terms of my own personal belief, I do not believe that Jewish law is binding or came from God. So I wonder, in your book, you talk about the prophetic social justice kind of reform, the kind of drag Torah form. Do you think that there can be this hearkening back to some of those Jewish Enlightenment values?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that all of to put on like my historian's hat, all of the Jewish denominations are new, basically. Uh, and reform as far as the denominations go is pretty old, actually, because it goes back to the early 19th century. And we can't, one way to think about what orthodoxy is requires thinking about it in its dialectical context or contest with reform. So I think absolutely. And I think that the Jewish world can learn a lot from the long tradition of the prophetic Reform Judaism that really is, I would argue, is like one of the most important ingredients of American Jewish identity, even and it's been forgotten. My caveat to that is that as things stand out in the United States, the challenge, I think, for the Jewish, or I'd even say historically, a challenge for the Jewish Enlightenment is how to articulate why its adherents should still be Jews rather than just universalists. Because if the values are the same, why do you need Judaism? And that's an interesting, ongoing question that lots of Jewish liberals and universalists have. Some people said maybe we don't need to be Jews, and they founded the Ethical Cultural Society, made Fieldson School in New York City. So, Judaism gave birth to this great ethical tradition. We won't have to hang on to the tribal elements of it. For some people, that was socialist. Yes. To the left of the Bund, where people said, yeah, we come to socialism, like Rosa Luxemburg, we come to socialism through our Jewish experience as oppressed people, but there's not any, I don't need the Torah to tell me don't oppress people. I just think that that's true, and my positionality, as we say today, means that, I'm on board with that agenda. But I think that that's one of the questions that over time, a Jewish universalists have to continually ask themselves. Otherwise, they reproduce, basically.
Avi, thank you so much for being here today. I'm curious. I really am interested in your paradigm for moving from Gen X to millennials. I want to try to expand that to Gen Z. At least from my perspective, I think that Gen Z suffers from a dangerous combination of little information and a lot of passion on both sides. One in which we had a political awakening during George Floyd, view things uniquely through American racial terms, where Zionism, in the view of most Gen Z Zionists, Israel could do no wrong. And in the view of most Gen Z anti-Zionists, Israel is an apartheid state. I'm curious how we overcome those information silos and to what degree you think the Jewish response to October 7 has set Zionism back.
The first question I wish I had an answer to. I don't know. I'm the 32 years old, so I don't know so much about what Gen Z is doing these days. I think though that a lot of the things that get pathologized in particular generations are true of young people generally. The same thing as since the lack of information, the surplus of passion is something people said about millennials also. And I think during the first round of Democratic Socialists, after 2016, those of us who were there remember they're gonna say kind of things. I think that that's just youth being youth. And I think it's okay, actually. Like, it doesn't let you learn more. Like, one of the things that is funny about, like, whatever, this is very personal. Like, I started writing the book when I was 27 years old, and I finished it right before I turned 30, which is like entailed a huge life transition. And a lot of the things that I thought or that I felt, a bit more to put it better, that I felt when I was 27, I didn't feel when the book came out. When I was 30 in the same way. And that's okay. Like, those are really important years that can be in your life where, like, you learn about stuff. And so I don't want to, I think you shouldn't be too hard on Gen Z for being like, be pathological in this way. I think there are certain Gen Z pathologies, and I think your description of the predicament is especially acute. But it wasn't to the same extent, but like, I was a sophomore in college during the first round of Black Lives Matter protests in 2015 after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. There was also a lot of like Ferguson to Palestine solidarity stuff and Zionism, white supremacy. 2016 for Black Lives put out that statement accusing Israel of committing genocide against the Palestinians way before October 7th. It didn't have the same charge to it because Israel wasn't literally fighting a war in which it killed 70,000 people. But what let's just say is like those ingredients were there then there for a long time. I think so. The second part of your question, absolutely, the American, like, could be what we would call the organized Jewish community's response to October 7th has been profoundly damaging. It's been damaging to the American Jewish community, the damaging the American politics. It's been damaging to Israel because it meant that at a time when American Jews could have leveraged their power to say to Israel, to the Netanyahu government, you cannot do these things. You cannot do this. There will be consequences if you continue on the path you're on. Basically, everyone double down on the notice. I don't think it's like it's not a particular mitzvah not to criticize like your people when you think they're doing something wrong, especially if you are genuinely concerned with their well-being and their future. And when I see the comments that come out of Mr. Precincts of like the mainstream Jewish world, and I think like this is just really damaging, and it's going to the basic refusal to recognize what is happening on the ground is, and like in some ways the damage is already begun with just living in the wake of that damage, but it compounds the more the denial of what's happening. It is the norm in American Jewish space, but like but also I think that those spaces, what we would call like the mainline, or what I call the book like mainline Jewish world, increasingly represent just a very small, like a much smaller proportion of Jews in practice. It used to be the case that they genuinely claim that they represent the majority of Jews. But in a world where like maybe a third of American Jews belong to a synagogue, probably fewer than that, like donate to AIPAC, we're not talking about organizations that have what we might call like popular legitimacy. These are organizations that maybe at one point did, but have lost that. And that's also part of why things like that anti-Zionist or Jewish left companies matter. It's here are groups that are contesting those legacy institutions' rights to speak on behalf of Jewish people in the American and political context. And it's a legitimate, like, that battle will have to be fought. I don't know how it's gonna how it will end though. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Here, Abby, and then we'll go back. No problem.
Michael, so right now we're sitting in a Catholic university, and I'm sort of curious how, and oftentimes we're required at Georgetown to take classes on theology. They don't have to be Catholic overtly, but just in theology in general. And I find myself in classes as a Jewish student saying, my religious belief isn't rooted in faith in God, and like that can feel weird and sort of dissonant with the dominant of the other Abrahamic religions. So I'm sort of curious how you see the role of allies, to use the current rhetoric to talk about it, in the Jewish community and moving forward, whether that's related to Israel or the future of American Judaism.
Like the relationship of American Jews to
others. other people of faith
Other
and non, people who was atheistic or agnostic both.
That's a big question.
I think that
There's a lot of directions that this could go. I mean, American Jews. I'll use an example. When I was in college, I took a course with Cornel West, and the sort of Black activist theologian, and I was very taken with Brother West's teachings as a young person who wasn't finding the kind of combination of prophetic fire and religious piety, let's say, that the Black prophetic tradition that Cornel West represented. And I remember having like office hours with him and being like, I want to do this, I need that, I want to write about it. What was I was going to write my paper about? And he basically was like, don't. This is big. I don't agree necessarily with like the pedagogy of publication modes, but it spoke to me in the moment. He was like, you don't have to go and write about other people's struggles in order to participate in this conversation. Like, you have a tradition, and part of having an identity is being connected to like the tradition of which that identity participates in. I think that this American Jews will find it easier to communicate with people of other faith traditions the more they understand themselves to be part of one. And the part of the critique that I make in Telechatter is that for a long time, American Jews put to the side, first of all, are generally like American Jews are among the least religious. Like if you look at the Pew survey of American Jews, why do American Jews are the least religious faith oriented population, like in the United States. That means it's actually hard for people to participate in these conversations. And for a long time, American Jewish organizations were on the front lines of trying to make sure that aid what as much as possible was not part of the national political conversation on the grounds that would lead to Jewish discrimination. Now we're in like a post multicultural era, and so we're okay with like particularism. It's okay for people to bring the different. We can have like a sheikh and a pastor and a rabbi all at the same day. Like that's become normal for us. But I think that American Jews are often very uncomfortable with that, with occupying like I would say like win particularity, and the only way to participate in a conversation of other cultures is to kind of like know your. I guess that's a sort of fucking back to roots argument that I would give that. Something you about to give.
Excuse me. Coming to U.S. politics, how do you feel that the center left, what place are they in? Or another way of asking this is, are Democrat candidates are they going to be able to thread the needle, or are they going to have to take a strong stand on one side or another with respect to Israel?
So my read of this is always goes back to the like fundamental disjuncture between Democratic Party activists and the rest of the electorate. There's a really big gap. So you see this play out like in the last election. This played out on a certain set of social issues and ideas around like gender and race. But I think that you could probably graft that polarization almost perfectly onto positions of Gaza. In other words, it may be the case that at a future Democratic convention, there will be a very strong push by progressives to make ending a military aid to Israel a little bit mistest for whoever would be the future Democratic candidate. I'm not sure that that matters to the broader electorate. It might. I mean, I've also been taken by like the crazy amount of it, like struck by the crazy amount of anti-Semitism on social media. So maybe it turns out that like polarizing around the Jews works, like in the United States in like raw electoral terms, and that's what the strategy is going to be. But I'm a little bit skeptical of that because I think that like the American electorate has a generally like anti-radical disposition, and if the view like if the Republican Party isn't able to like brand Democrats as radical on an issue by virtue of a certain stand that they might take vis-a-vis Israel, I'm not sure that that will like be damning in the national in the national election. But certainly, I think like we can take Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's appearance at the Munich Security Council last week as a pretty good barometer for where the progressive demand about Israel-Palestine is going to be for 2028, which is to end aid to a country that's committed genocide. That's going to make for a really big like convention fight. I imagine the I don't know. I can't pretend. I'm not gonna predict, but I'm not convinced that the rest of the electorate in the United States shares AOC's tradition about this. The way that I don't think that I think that it's been proven that much of the electorate doesn't share AOC's views on like other things.
And over here, sorry.
This sort of built to the last question. Well, what do you think? How dangerous do you think it is that, like, you talked about the Democrats, but now among the Republicans, you see this strong sense, particularly from younger Republicans, but as well as from Tucker Carlson's and the older ones, but mostly from younger Republicans, a very strong anti-Israel, many would say simply anti-Semitic platform, but this weird coalescence between younger Democrats and younger Republicans against Israel that we haven't I mean, the Democrats have been for a long time, but we haven't previously seen it from the right as we're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like this moment has somewhat passed, but I thought it was very striking that like who became national celebrities because of their Israel position in the wake of Israel's war. It was not any leftists. It was Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes. And somehow the right managed to pivot much more strongly and at least in the public sphere. I think OPC and social media and all these things, it doesn't always trickle down to like your normal voter. It's to the extent that there is a normal voter in the United States anymore. But I think that like one of the ironies of the situation, I think it's much more likely that a Republican presidency ends. And like, I mean, Netanyahu has already basically accepted this, that Trump will be in office when the new memorandum of understanding, which like allocates U.S. military aid to Israel, will be renegotiated. And that MOU is going to be the last one, basically. And it's not going to be any Democrat who's going to phase out military aid to Israel. It's going to be Donald Trump in a plan authored by the Heritage Foundation. There's all kinds of weird counting in that plan that like is sort of a fake out to appease this more isolationist base that I think was always there in the Republican Party because it didn't have factors that were pushing it to be vocal, and for a long time there was like the neocon consensus within the right like held and made pro-Israel part of pro-Americanism, but as pro-Americanism turned nationalist and isolationist, and it became much harder for younger Republicans to argue why they should also be pro-Israel if they're also going to be like America, if they're going to be America first. Didn't leave room for like the neoconservative emphasis in that way. Obviously, there's also a huge amount of like just regular anti-Semitism involved in a kind of conspiracy theorizing. I mean, so when we're thinking about this, a conspiracy, anti-Semitism in some ways is often takes the form of a conspiracy theory, because anti-Semitism, unlike other forms of racism, in which like denigrate the qualities of the people that they are against, anti-Semitism is like a theory of exorbitant Jewish power. And that's also why it can kind of pull from both sides of the far ends of the political spectrum, because when populists take in power and Jews are figured as power, then like it's spiritual. That doesn't mean all forms of populism ended anti-Semitism, but that there's a reason why famously, I mean, there's two quotes that I'll end this quote on. Like the quote that leftists love is the quote from the early 20th century socialist militant August Bebel, that socialism, that it's anti-Semitism is a socialism of fools. To which the philosopher Leo Strauss famously responded, "Too bad that most people are fools." In other words, like, it may turn out that if you wanted to have, and this historically is what happened, and that's why that quote by Strauss is somewhat prophetic, that like actually it was not socialism that won the European revolutionary working class. It was anti-Semitism. And so I don't think we're like living in 1939. I don't think history replays itself. I don't believe in historical cycles and all of that. But obviously there are certain sort of structural similarities between the way that anti-Semitic conspiracy theorizing is really good at taking anti-Semitic populist energy that sometimes comes from the left and co-opting it into a right-wing racist place.
I think if we have time for just one last question, and then we'll yeah. But
Thanks, and George, for intriguing intervention. Certainly have motivated me to read this work. So I guess my question is, where do you see the outlines between nationalism and religiosity within the American Jewish community? And ask me this question, please, is first, you have cited the main scholars who embrace that debate about universalism and nationalistic tendencies, such as Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Marx, on the missing report now is Trotsky. But the second reason for my question actually is nationalism is often cited as the power that undermines the liberal power in general. So I guess that has also to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict in general and the current conflict that in Palestine. So where does nationalism fit within your analysis? Deliberate assessments within the American.
That's a great question, and like the historian in me has a different answer than like
And an audio from teaching nationalism go workbooks as well.
than the journalist, and the has it's like the historian and says, look, we think of liberalism and nationalism today as intention, but actually liberalism and nationalism were born together and were at the beginning inextricable. Think about the Italian Mazzini as the father of nationalism. Liberal and nationalism. Why? Because liberalism required the nation-state form as its political container. And even now, when we think about the European Union, for all of the aspirations of philosophers like Yuri Habermas to reach a kind of post-national constellation, Europe is a union of nations, and part of the rise of right-wing populism in Europe has been stimulated by a sense of the nation being somehow undermined, whether that's pernicious or true. So, from that perspective, I tend to think of like what the problem. What's missing in Israel-Palestine, or the problem in Israel-Palestine, is not that there's too much nationalism, so there's not enough nationalism. I think there's not a Palestinian state, that there isn't equal self-determination. It's not, everyone here will live in a kind of United States of Israel, as Muammar Gaddafi once called it in the New York Times. I bet, like that. I think that even if that were desirable, I'm not sure it's feasible, because I also don't think it's desirable. I don't think most people who live in between the river and the sea think it's desirable either, because they want the things that nationalism forbids them. Self-determination, a civic culture that's particular to their own, all these things that people that fought for a very long time. I think when I think about, and this is a ball bit, for when I think about Israel-Palestine at least, and then I'll get to the American context in a minute, like you guys are Palestine, I think it's really one of the challenges the Palestinian national movement has right now, is that it's faced with the challenge of making an argument for self-determination at a moment when like statehood and self-determination have been greatly devalued, and aren't even hard to mobilize around, especially because, I'll leave it at that. In the American context, I think American Jews with historical consciousness of the Holocaust as the product of excess violent nationalism are very opposed, would even say nationalism is bad for the Jews. And that gets back to one of these tensions between the diaspora and Israel. American Jews say nationalism is bad for the Jews, but actually Zionism arose as an answer to the fact that nationalism was bad for the Jews when they were Idar. So there might not be an answer about nationalism and Jewish identity that crosses, but bridges those two contexts. Nationalism might really be bad for the Jews when Jews are minority, but it might also be a container for, let's say, collective and embodied continuity in the form of a state, and that was what the Zionism that it's, let's say, most basic. I don't know if that answered the question. I disagree.
Wonderful. Josh, please help me thank Josh. Okay. Yeah, nice to see you. Especially thought-provoking discussions that we've had here on the CJC. It's kind of hard to sum up this discussion in a few lines, but it's definitely given us a lot of food for thought. And at the ripe old age of 32, we are expecting lots review and looking forward to your next. Hopefully, it will come out before your work at Yale, and we'll continue to follow your work at Haaretz and beyond. So thank you, Bert.
Thank you so much.